The morning Jennie Bailey rode into Harlan Creek with nothing but a bedroll, a worn leather satchel, and enough grit to shame the devil himself. The town barely blinked, until she tied her horse to the post outside the Abbott Ranch office and walked through the front door like she owned the place. Harlan Creek sat in the high plains of Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1883, a town that smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular ambition of men who believed the frontier would make them kings. The Abbott Ranch spread across 12,000 acres of rolling grass and creek-fed meadow, the largest operation in 100 miles, known for its fine quarter horses and its ill-tempered owner. Tobias Abbott had built every fence post, hired every hand, and buried his father on that land, and he did not take kindly to surprises before his second cup of coffee. Jennie Bailey had not slept in 2 days. She had ridden from Cheyenne following a hand-scrawled advertisement she had torn from a tack board outside the land office. Foreman wanted, ABBOTT Ranch, Harlan Creek. Experience with cattle, horses, and difficult men required. Inquire within. She had read those words 4 times, folded the paper into her coat pocket, and decided that every single item on that list described her precisely. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of honest labor, with dark copper hair pinned severely beneath a wide-brimmed hat and gray eyes that had the unsettling quality of appearing to measure everything they looked at, and find it mostly adequate. She wore men's work clothes, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, and boots that had seen 3 Wyoming winters, because she had stopped caring what strangers thought somewhere around the time she turned 19 and took over the management of her father's failing cattle operation in Colorado after he broke both legs falling from a roof. She had run that ranch for 4 years. She had saved it from bankruptcy. She had paid off the creditors, rebuilt the herd, and then sold the whole thing at a fair price when her father passed quietly in his sleep the previous winter, leaving her with a small inheritance, no particular reason to stay in Colorado, and a restless energy that had no good outlet except forward motion. Tobias Abbott was standing behind a rough-hewn desk when she walked in, and he looked exactly like a man who had been dealing with paperwork he hated for the better part of an hour. He was 32, tall and lean in the way of men who had never stopped doing physical work despite having the money to stop, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that could have been used to split kindling. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He had a pencil behind his ear. He looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who expected to see one of his hands coming to explain something that would cost him money. He did not expect to see a woman. "Can I help you?" he said in a tone that was not unfriendly but carried the distinct undertone of a man whose time was valuable and whose patience was finite. "I came for the foreman position," Jennie said. There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that has weight to it, the kind that expands to fill the room and press against the walls. Tobias Abbott set down his pencil. He looked at her carefully, the way a man looks at something that has presented a problem he was not anticipating at 8 in the morning. Then he said very evenly, "That position is for a ranch foreman." "I understand what a foreman is," Jennie said. "It involves managing 37 hands. I have managed up to 22. I am prepared to manage 37. He leaned back in his chair, and she could see him formulating his objection carefully, like a man laying out fence posts before stringing wire. "Ma'am," he said, and she already disliked the word, the way he weighted it with a gentle finality. "The men on this ranch have been working cattle since before either one of us could walk. They are not going to take orders from someone qualified," Jennie said pleasantly. "I was going to say from someone they don't respect." "Respect is earned," she said. "I have earned it before. I expect I can earn it again. This is not a small operation." "I can read," she said, which was perhaps sharper than strictly necessary. But she had been riding for 2 days on very little sleep, and she was not inclined toward excessive diplomacy. 1,000 acres, mixed cattle and horses, established breeding program for quarter horses, seasonal drives to the railhead at Rawlins. "I have done my research, Mr. Abbott." He stood up from behind the desk. He was taller than she had estimated, and she revised her estimate upward without changing her expression. He walked around the desk and stood at a respectful but assessing distance, and she stood her ground and met his eyes directly, which seemed to give him some momentary difficulty. The advertisement did not specify experience requirements because I expected to interview men with obvious qualifications, he said. This is a foreman position, not a. I ran the Bailey Ranch in Larimer County, Colorado for 4 years, she said. 140 head of cattle, 18 horses, a crew of 12 at peak season, and a breeding program for Morgan horses that I designed and implemented myself. In the second year I managed the operation, we turned our first profit in 5 years. In the fourth year, I negotiated the sale of the entire operation for 60% more than the appraiser's estimate, because I understood exactly what we had built, and I did not accept the first offer. I have references from the Larimer County Bank, from Hendricks Cattle Company in Fort Collins, and from a man named Gus Welland, who was my head hand for 3 of those 4 years and who will tell you that I am the most capable person he has ever worked for. And Gus Welland does not say things like that easily because he is generally opposed to complimenting anyone. There was another pause. This one was different from the first. "You are not from Harlan Creek," he said. "No," she agreed. "The men here will have opinions," she said. "Men generally do. I have found that opinions change when the work gets done and the numbers improve and the horses don't die of preventable illness." "May I see the operation?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He crossed his arms and looked at her with an expression she could not fully categorize, part skepticism, part something that was not quite skepticism, a hairline fracture in the certainty he had walked into the conversation carrying. "The hands are going to say something," he warned her. "Let them," she said. "I would rather they say it to my face than behind my back." He began his objection again. He had an objection about the bunkhouse arrangements. She pointed out that she had slept in a tack room for 8 months during a bad winter and had no strong feelings about sleeping arrangements. He had an objection about the cattle drives and the rough terrain of the northern pastures. She noted that she had driven cattle through a blizzard in November of 1880 and had not lost a single head. He circled back to the hands, to their likely resistance, to the particular culture of men who had been doing this work their whole lives. She reminded him calmly that culture was managed from the top, and that if the owner of the ranch made clear who held authority, the hands generally followed that signal. He mentioned, somewhat desperately, that the previous foreman, a man named Calhoun, had left under difficult circumstances, and that the crew was currently unsettled. "Then what you need," Jennie said, "is someone steady, not someone familiar, steady." 20 minutes after she had walked through the door, Tobias Abbott stood with his arms still crossed, looking at the floor, and then he looked up at her and said, "Your references, do you have them in writing?" "In my satchel," she said. "Leave them with me. I will need 3 days to check them." "That is reasonable," she said. "I am not hiring you," he said immediately, as though the clarification were urgent. "I am reviewing your references. That is a different thing." "Of course," she said, in a tone that was perfectly neutral. He never brought up the argument again. Not when her references came back flawless. Not when he told his hands that morning at breakfast that they had a new foreman, and the dining hall went so quiet that the only sound was the wind against the eaves. Not on the day, 6 months later, when the oldest hand on the ranch, a gray-bearded Texan named Polk, who had been wrangling cattle since before the war, told Tobias Abbott over a whiskey in town that Miss Bailey was, in his considered opinion, the best foreman the Abbott ranch had ever had. Tobias Abbott had simply nodded and said he was aware of that, and he had not looked back toward the ranch with an expression anyone could have called longing, because he was very careful in those early months about what his face did when her name came up. But that is getting ahead of the story. The first morning, Jennie walked out to the corral at dawn before any of the hands were awake, and she stood at the rail and watched the horses in the gray, early light 17 working horses, and 3 breeding mares, and a young stallion that paced his separate enclosure with a nervous, electric energy that she recognized immediately as intelligence too large for the space it had been given. She studied the layout of the outbuildings, the position of the hay barn relative to the main house, the distance from the bunkhouse to the tool shed, the state of the fence line visible from where she stood. She was cataloging, which was something she did automatically, the way other people breathe. She heard the creak of the porch behind her and turned to find Tobias Abbott standing there with 2 tin cups, and she understood from the way he moved unhurried, a little uncertain, that he had not expected her to already be outside. "Coffee," he said, which was all he said, and he walked down to the corral and handed her one of the cups. She took it. The coffee was strong and slightly burnt, the kind that meant someone had made it in a hurry and let it sit on the stove for 5 minutes too long, and it was wonderful in the cold morning air. "The stallion," she said, nodding toward the separate enclosure. "How long has he been kept alone?" Tobias looked at the animal. 6 months. He was fighting with the other horses. Nearly put one of the geldings through the fence. "He is bored," Jennie said. "He needs a job." Quarter horse stock like that needs to be worked every day or it turns inward and gets dangerous. Has anyone been working him? Not regularly. Calhoun didn't trust him. What is his name? Doesn't have one. The hands call him the Gray. She looked at the stallion, who had come to the fence at the sound of voices and was watching them with dark, bright eyes that held none of the flat resignation she associated with neglected animals. "His name is Archimedes," she said. Tobias looked at her. "It means something," she said. "He deserves a name that means something." There was a small pause, and she saw something shift in Tobias Abbott's expression, not agreement exactly, but a kind of interested recalibration, as though she had said something that landed differently than he expected. He looked back at the horse. "Archimedes," he repeated slowly, tasting the word. "I will start working him tomorrow," she said. "He will be manageable within a month. Calhoun thought he was dangerous. Calhoun," she said, keeping her voice carefully even, "left this ranch under difficult circumstances. I am not Calhoun." Tobias looked at her over the rim of his cup, and she met his eyes steadily, and neither of them looked away for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. The hands assembled that morning in the yard after breakfast, as Tobias had instructed, and they stood in the way men stand when they have been told something they don't want to hear and are deciding how much to show it on their faces. There were 37 of them, ranging from boys of 17 or 18 just starting out to Polk, who was somewhere in his late 50s, and had the particular authority that comes from having survived everything. They looked at Jennie with expressions that ran the spectrum from skeptical to deeply skeptical, with a few outliers on the end of openly hostile, and one young hand in the back a red-haired boy named Dell who couldn't have been more than 18, who looked more curious than anything else. She stood in front of them and did not smile and did not apologize for existing. She said her name once. She said that she had run a cattle operation in Colorado for 4 years, and that she was not interested in their opinions about her qualifications, because those opinions were going to change as they worked together, and in the meantime she had a job to do. She said that she expected the same from them that any good foreman expected: honest work, no shortcutting, and the immediate reporting of any problem with animals, equipment, or personnel before that problem became a crisis. She said that any hand who brought her a problem early would have her full support in solving it. She said that any hand who hid a problem until it became a catastrophe would need to explain that decision to Mr. Abbott, and that was not a conversation she recommended. Then she asked Polk, because she had already identified him as the axis around which the others oriented themselves, if he would show her the north pasture fence line, because she had observed from the hill on her ride in that the fence appeared to have been damaged in the recent rains, and she wanted to assess it before the cattle rotated up there next week. Polk looked at her for a long, measuring moment. He had roomy blue eyes and a face like weathered saddle leather, and he had been doing this since the war, and he was not impressed by much. He pulled at his beard. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and went to get his horse. The men dispersed. Tobias stood at the edge of the yard and watched, and she was aware of him watching, and she deliberately did not look in his direction, because there was work to be done, and she had found in her experience that the most effective thing she could do in the first week at any operation was find the most concrete, obvious, necessary task, and do it so thoroughly and competently that it became impossible to argue with her presence. The fence in the north pasture was worse than it looked from a distance. 3 full posts had washed out and 2 sections of wire were down entirely, which meant that if the cattle had been rotated up there as scheduled, they would have been loose on the open range by morning. Polk pointed at the damage and said nothing, but his jaw shifted in a way that suggested he was reassessing something. "Who does the fence work normally?" she asked. "Dell and Rosario mostly," Polk said. "Young hands. Get them up here this afternoon with replacement posts and a full wire kit," she said. "I want this done before sundown." "That is a full afternoon of work for 2 boys," Polk said. "Then we will all do it," she said, and she pulled off her coat and hung it on the only fence post still standing and went to work. Polk watched her for approximately 30 seconds, then he dismounted and did the same. By sundown the fence was solid and the cattle rotation was back on schedule, and Jennie Bailey ate dinner in the bunkhouse dining hall with 37 ranch hands and said very little and listened to everything. She learned in the space of that one meal that there was a long-standing argument between 2 of the senior hands' brothers named Vic and Otis Garland about the grazing rotation in the East Meadow that had been simmering since the previous spring and was quietly poisoning the efficiency of the whole eastern operation. She learned that the young stallion's isolation had created a secondary problem, because 3 of the mares had become anxious without a dominant herd presence, and their feeding patterns had deteriorated. She learned that the farrier who serviced the ranch had been overcharging and doing inferior work, and that the hands knew it, but Calhoun had refused to address it because the farrier was his cousin. She filed all of this away. She would address the Garland brothers by the end of the week. She would speak to Tobias about the farrier. The mares could be managed once she had Archimedes working properly. Tobias Abbott, for his part, spent that first day doing exactly what the owner of a large ranch does, riding fence on the western boundary, reviewing supply orders, dealing with a disagreement between the ranch's cook, a large jovial man named Augusto, and the supply man from town about the quality of the last beef shipment, which Augusto found personally offensive because he considered it a commentary on his cooking, even though the problem was clearly with the supply man's sourcing. Tobias resolved this by eating a plate of Augusto's cooking in the kitchen and telling him, with what appeared to be absolute sincerity, that the problem was entirely the beef and not the cooking, which satisfied Augusto completely and cost Tobias nothing but 15 minutes and a bout of genuine appreciation for the biscuits. He was good at that, the human element of managing a large operation. He knew his men's names and their troubles and their particular skills and where they were best deployed. He understood the land in the way of someone who had grown up on it, who knew which springs ran dry in August and which pastures went sour in a wet year, and where the cattle tended to drift in a north wind. What he was less good at was the organizing logic of the operation, the scheduling, the documentation, the long-range planning that kept a ranch profitable instead of merely surviving. His previous foreman, Calhoun, had been adequate at the tactical level and disastrous at the strategic one, which was a combination that had cost Abbott Ranch $3,000 in preventable losses the previous year. Jennie Bailey had seen the ledgers. Tobias had shown them to her on the second morning with an air of slight defiance, as though daring her to comment. She had sat at his desk for an hour and gone through them without speaking, and then she had said, very quietly, "You have a feed cost problem in the third quarter that is not a drought problem. It is a supplier problem. You are being overcharged by approximately 18%, and your receiving is not catching shortages on delivery." He stared at her. "Also," she said, turning a page, "your breeding program records are incomplete. You cannot make good selection decisions for next season without complete records. How has your breeding program been documented? Calhoun kept notes, he said. Where are the notes? He opened a drawer and produced a collection of loose papers that were approximately as organized as a pile of autumn leaves. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at him. I see, she said, in a tone that communicated a great deal without saying any of it. I was aware there was a record-keeping problem, he said stiffly. I will organize these, she said. It will take several evenings. I will need access to this office in the evenings. It is your office, he said, before he seemed to fully think about the implications of saying it, and then he said more carefully, I mean you should use it as needed, for ranch business. Thank you, she said, and went back to the ledger. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to before finding a reason to be somewhere else on the ranch. The first 2 weeks were a sustained exercise in establishing authority, which Jennie had done before and which she had learned required a particular combination of visible competence, absolute fairness, and strategic patience. She worked alongside the hands rather than standing over them. She remembered names immediately and used them. She solved the Garland brothers' disagreement about the East Meadow by going out and surveying the grazing herself, and then presenting them both with a rotation schedule that acknowledged the validity of both their positions while resolving the operational problem. And she did it in front of the whole crew at the morning meeting, which meant that the resolution became public and neither brother could privately relitigate it without looking petulant. She fired the farrier. She did this in the 3rd week, after personally examining all 30 horses' shoes and finding that 8 of them had been done incorrectly, not dangerously, but poorly, in ways that would lead to problems over the next several months. She told Tobias, who looked uncomfortable but ultimately said she had the authority to hire and fire within her department, which was how she had understood the position from the beginning. The farrier came out to complain, and she listened to him fully, and then told him his work did not meet the ranch's standards, and his services were no longer required, and she was courteous and final about it, and he left, and she found a new farrier from the next county over who charged less and shod horses beautifully. Tobias heard about this from Polk, who had been watching everything with the measuring attention of a man determining whether his initial skepticism was justified. Polk told him, over the same evening fire where they often talked, that the new foreman had fired the farrier and replaced him the same week. Tobias had said, "Good," and meant it, and Polk had given him a look that was difficult to categorize. The evenings became a quiet pattern that neither of them initiated exactly but that developed naturally, the way water finds the lowest path. Jennie worked in the office most evenings, reorganizing the breeding records and cross-referencing the supply invoices against the receiving logs, and Tobias found himself drifting back to the house earlier than he used to, drawn by some gravity he was trying not to examine too closely. Sometimes he would come to the office to ask about a logistical matter. Sometimes she would come to find him with a question about the ranch's history. The records only went back so far, and he held the institutional knowledge she needed to make sense of them. They talked easily. That was the thing he noticed, which he found slightly alarming, because he had not talked easily with many people since his father died. He was a private man by nature, not unfriendly but self-contained, and the ranch had occupied him so thoroughly for the past several years that he had not noticed the contraction of his social world, until suddenly there was someone sitting across the desk from him every evening who asked precise questions and offered opinions that were worth engaging with, and the conversations lasted longer than either of them quite intended. One evening in the 4th week, they argued about the hay supply. He thought they had enough stored for winter. She disagreed, citing the current inventory, the projected consumption rate based on the herd size, and the historical data she had found in the records suggesting that 3 of the last 5 years had involved harder winters than the region's average, and that in each of those years, the ranch had run short of hay in February and been forced to purchase at crisis prices that significantly eroded their winter margins. He pushed back, citing his own experience of the land and the feel of the season. She acknowledged his experience and held her position. He recalculated on paper, which he had not been in the habit of doing, and discovered that she was right by approximately 40 tons. He said, "I will order additional hay," she said. "I have already drawn up the order. I wanted your approval before sending it." He looked at the order, which was exactly the right amount and had been negotiated at a better price per ton than he had ever managed with this supplier. He signed it. He handed it back to her. Their hands didn't touch because the desk was wide, but it occurred to him afterward that he had been aware of the space between their hands in a way that was disproportionate to its practical significance. He told himself this was because she was his foreman. He told himself it was because she was the most competent person he had hired in 10 years, and he respected that competence. He told himself several other things in the privacy of the room he shared only with himself, and most of them were true, and none of them were quite the whole truth. Jennie Bailey was having her own version of these conversations with herself. She had learned long ago to be careful. A woman managing men, in a time and place where that was unusual, could not afford the confusion that came from personal entanglement with the employer. She had watched other women in similar positions make that mistake and pay for it in ways that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with the particular cruelties that the world reserved for women who stepped outside their assigned roles and then had the additional temerity to have feelings. She had kept herself careful in Colorado, and she intended to keep herself careful here. But Tobias Abbott was inconveniently interesting. He was not interesting in the way of men who tried to be interesting, who performed their personalities at full volume. He was interesting in the way of someone who thought carefully before speaking and said things that meant more than they appeared to mean. He was interested in her opinions in a way that was different from the men who were simply waiting for their turn to talk. He actually revised his thinking when she gave him new information, which was a quality she had found so rare as to be nearly theoretical. He was also, and she tried to note this with the same detached clarity with which she noted feed costs and breeding records, very good with the horses. She watched him one morning with Archimedes, who by the 3rd week of Jennie's working program had settled considerably and was beginning to accept being ridden. Tobias had come out to the corral without any particular announced purpose, and he had stood at the fence and watched her work the horse for a while, and then she had handed him the reins with a look that was more invitation than instruction, and he had taken them and spent the next half hour with the stallion in a patient, quiet, wordless communication that she found herself watching with more attention than was professionally required. He had good hands with horses gentle and clear, without the tension that made animals nervous. He caught her watching when he brought Archimedes back to the fence, and she held his gaze steadily and said, "You have a feel for him. You should ride him more often. He respects you." "He respects you," Tobias said. "He tolerates me." "He does not tolerate easily," she said. "That is better than most people get with him in 3 weeks." He looked at the horse. He said, "He is something, isn't he?" She said, "Yes." And she was not entirely talking about the horse, and she was aware of that, and she looked away quickly and found something to do with the water trough. The crisis came in October, when the creek that ran through the north pasture flooded following 3 days of hard rain and drove 42 head of cattle off the east bank and through a 1/4 mile of broken fence line into the neighboring property. This was the kind of crisis that happened on ranches, and that separated the operations with good leadership from the ones that spiraled into chaos, because it required immediate decisive action, coordination of the whole crew, and the management of at least 3 different problems simultaneously. The cattle's location and safety, the fence repair, and the diplomatic matter of the neighboring landowner, a man named Hector Vasquez, whose relationship with the Abbott Ranch had been cordial but cautious ever since a boundary dispute 3 years ago. Jennie was on horseback, and in the north pasture within 20 minutes of being told about the breach. She organized the crew into 3 working groups, one to locate and hold the cattle, one to begin temporary fence repairs that would at least contain the situation, and one to ride to the Vasquez property with a message and an offer of assistance. She rode with the message group herself, because she had quickly calculated that the human diplomacy piece was the highest risk variable. Hector Vasquez was a man in his mid-40s, lean and dark-eyed, who had come to Wyoming Territory from New Mexico with his family 20 years ago, and built his ranch through the same combination of hard work and land knowledge that had built the Abbott operation. He was standing outside his barn when Jennie rode up with young Dell at her side, and he watched her approach with an expression that was careful and waiting. She introduced herself directly and told him exactly what had happened, including which pastures his land adjoined, the approximate number of cattle that had come through the fence, and what her crew was already doing to address it. She offered the Abbott ranch's labor to repair whatever damage the cattle had done on his side of the fence, and committed to having the cattle off his land by morning or sooner. She did not apologize in the vague, face-saving way that escalated disputes. She acknowledged the problem clearly and presented a solution. Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in accented but precise English, "The last Abbott foreman sent a boy with a note." "I came myself," she said. "This is the Abbott ranch's responsibility and I am the person responsible for it." He nodded slowly. He said, "My east fence needs repair too, where your cattle ran through." "That is your responsibility also." "Agreed," she said immediately. "I will have a crew there by tomorrow morning." He nodded again, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but indicated the tension had shifted. He said, "You are new." 6 weeks, she said. "I had heard," he said, which told her that word had traveled as it always did. "I had also heard you fired the Reeves farrier. He was doing inferior work." Vasquez's expression shifted into something that was unmistakably approval. "That man shod 6 of my horses badly last spring," he said. "I removed him from my account then. I am glad you saw it." She stayed for 20 minutes, long enough to establish the specific terms of the repair agreement and to drink a cup of coffee with Vasquez and his wife, a quiet, observant woman named Catalina who asked Jennie 2 or 3 sharp questions about the breeding program and revealed in passing that she had an excellent eye for horses herself. Jennie made a note of that for later. She rode back to find the crisis already 3/4 resolved. 38 of the 42 cattle had been located and held. The other 4 were found an hour later grazing calmly in a stand of cottonwoods along the creek. The temporary fence was holding. The crew was tired and muddy and satisfied in the way of people who have handled something difficult together. Tobias Abbott was waiting at the edge of the pasture when she rode back. He had been managing the fence repair on his end, and he was as muddy as anyone, his hat dark with rain, and he looked at her when she came up and said, "Vasquez." "Resolved," she said. "We owe him fence repair on the east side tomorrow. I told him we would be there." He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than the moment probably was. Then he said, "That boundary dispute 3 years ago, I thought he was going to hate us permanently." "He does not hate you," she said. "He was angry about the handling. He respects the land and the work. Show him the same and he will be fair." Tobias looked out over the pasture where the crew was working and said, almost to himself, "Calhoun never went over himself." "I know," she said. He looked at her then full on in the gray October rain, and she looked back, and there was a moment that was different from all the other moments they had shared, not louder, not more dramatic, just different in quality, like a note played in a different key. He said, "I made the right decision," she said, "about the hay storage." "Yes, you did." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and slightly rough, and she turned her horse before the warmth of it could settle anywhere it wasn't supposed to. But she smiled, facing away from him into the rain. November brought cold and the first serious snow and the beginning of the indoor season's particular rhythm. The shorter days, the heavy work of keeping animals warm and fed, the long dark evenings in the ranch house. Jennie had reorganized the breeding records by this point, and had begun drafting the selection plan for the spring breeding season, and Tobias had taken to reviewing her plans in the evenings, in a way that had evolved from professional consultation into something that functioned more like conversation interrupted occasionally by work. He had begun, without either of them discussing it, to have Augusto make extra coffee in the evenings. She had begun, without mentioning it, to linger over the records slightly longer than strictly necessary once she had finished the work she had come to do. Polk noticed. Polk noticed everything, and he was old enough and settled enough in his position on the ranch that he could allow himself small, private observations that he kept to himself, stored like smooth stones in his coat pocket. He watched his employer find reasons to be near the office window when the foreman was working late, and he watched the foreman straighten up slightly whenever the rancher's horse came into the yard, and he said nothing about any of it to anyone except the old gray cat that lived in the hay barn, and the cat, to its credit, kept its own counsel. Dell, the young red-haired hand, had developed an open admiration for Jennie that was entirely professional and slightly puppyish, and he had appointed himself a kind of informal assistant in ways that she managed with affectionate practicality, sending him on the jobs that genuinely needed someone eager and fast, and redirecting his tendency to follow her around by giving him real responsibility that kept him occupied and growing. By November, he could repair any kind of fence, and had begun to show a talent for working with young horses that she quietly encouraged. The snow came seriously in late November, and with it came the particular test of any ranch's winter preparation, keeping 200 head of cattle fed and watered and not frozen across 12,000 acres in sub-zero temperatures that the Wyoming high plains produced with cheerful malice. The additional hay Jennie had ordered proved exactly as necessary as she had calculated. Twice, she had to adjust the feeding rotation when temperatures dropped sharply and consumption rates increased. Once at 3 in the morning, she was woken by Dell hammering on her door to tell her that the water line to the south barn had frozen, and the horses in there were without water. She was dressed and outside in 4 minutes. Tobias appeared 2 minutes after that. He had heard the hammering, and they spent the next 3 hours working together in the freezing dark with lanterns and fire, and a collection of tools and ingenuity to thaw the line and restore the water supply. They worked side by side in the cramped space under the barn floor where the pipe ran, close enough that their breath made the same cloud, and they did not speak much because there was no need to. And when the water finally ran again and they both sat back against the barn wall in the straw with the shared exhaustion of people who have done a hard thing together in the cold, Tobias Abbott looked at her in the lantern light and said, "I cannot imagine what this winter would have looked like without you here." She looked at her hands, which were red from the cold. She said, "You would have managed." "I would have managed worse," he said. "There is a difference." She looked up at him. In the lantern light, he looked less guarded than he usually did, the cold and the tiredness and the relief stripping away some of the careful quality he normally carried. He looked like someone who was saying something true. She said, "Thank you." It was a simple thing, but she said it in a way that meant more than the 2 words. He said, "Jennie," which was the first time he had used her given name, and then he appeared to realize it and looked slightly uncertain, as though the word had left his mouth before he had finished deciding whether to say it. She said, "Tobias," in the same tone, and let it stand. Neither of them moved to leave the barn floor for another few minutes, which could not be explained by the lingering need to monitor the water line. December. Christmas approached the way it did on working ranches, noticed and appreciated, but subordinated to the relentless rhythm of the cattle's needs, which did not observe holidays. Augusto made special food, and the hands gathered for a long meal on Christmas Eve, and Tobias gave each hand a small bonus in an envelope, which Jennie had helped him calculate, and she received her own envelope, which she noted was slightly more than her contractual rate, and she looked at him across the table and he looked at his plate. She spent Christmas morning riding the north pasture fence in the early light, the snow blue and still around her, and she thought about her father's ranch in Colorado and how different it had felt, smaller, more embattled, always the feeling of fighting against something. Here she tried to find the right word. Settled. Not done, not finished, but oriented, like a compass finding north. The thought of Tobias Abbott ran under this reflection like a current, which she was aware of and did not try to dam up, because she had become tired of fighting useful information. She was in love with him. The realization arrived not as a sudden shock, but as the confirmation of something she had been circling for weeks without letting herself name. She sat on her horse in the December quiet and acknowledged it the way she acknowledged any important fact, directly, with a clear eye for its implications. The implications were, professionally speaking, complicated. She was the foreman. He was the owner. She had fought hard for this position and the respect it carried, and she was not interested in any dynamic that reduced her to something less than what she had earned. She did not know had made it her business not to speculate too closely what he felt. She knew he valued her. She knew he liked her company. She knew the way his voice changed when he talked to her, and she knew that people in love often had a tendency to read too much into the changed voices of people they were in love with. She turned her horse back toward the ranch and resolved to observe carefully and act on evidence. January arrived with brutal cold and 3 days of the kind of blizzard that makes Wyoming famous, during which the entire crew was confined to the ranch and Jennie organized work rotations within the buildings to keep the animals safe and the people occupied. On the second day of the blizzard, a heifer in the breeding barn began to calve 3 weeks early, which was a problem because early calves in a blizzard had poor survival odds, and this particular heifer was one of the 3 best in the breeding program. Jennie delivered that calf herself, with Tobias holding the lantern and Polk standing by, because he had seen more calves born than anyone and was a useful resource in complications. The birth was difficult and then it was not, and the calf, a bull calf, small but vigorous, was breathing and the heifer was on her feet within an hour. Jennie sat in the straw with the calf's head in her lap, warming it with a blanket and rubbing circulation back into its legs, and Tobias sat 3 feet away watching both of them with an expression that he had stopped trying to manage. Polk, who had been in the barn doorway, appeared to find a reason to step outside. Tobias said, very quietly, "You are extraordinary." She looked up from the calf. She said, "The calf is extraordinary. He came 3 weeks early in a blizzard and he is already trying to stand. I am just the one who was present." "You were not just present," he said. He had set down the lantern and he was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at her with an openness that she had not seen from him before, unguarded, direct, real. You have changed this ranch, Jennie. You have changed how it works and how it feels, and he stopped. He appeared to weigh something. She waited. "I did not intend for this to be anything other than what it is supposed to be," he said carefully, which was a sentence that communicated rather more than it was technically saying. "You are my foreman. That is an important position and you have earned it, and I have no interest in making you uncomfortable or—" "Tobias," she said. He looked at her. "I rode out on Christmas morning," she said, "and I sat on my horse in the north pasture for 20 minutes thinking about the ranch, and I could not stop thinking about you. That is useful information, and I am telling you it directly because I have found that directness saves a great deal of time." The barn was very quiet. The calf moved under her hands. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls. He said, "I have thought about you every day since you walked into my office." She said, "I know." He said, "You know, I have good observational skills," she said. "It is part of why you hired me." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and warm, and it turned something over in the air between them. And she set the calf very gently in the straw because it was standing now anyway. And she stood up and he stood up, and they were very close in the lantern light and the warm smell of the barn, and she looked at him directly, and he looked at her with an expression that had no management in it at all. He kissed her carefully, the way a man kisses a woman when he is fully aware of what he is doing and wants to do it right, and she kissed him back with the same quality of complete, clear intention, and the calf tottered against the straw beside them, and outside the blizzard was very loud, and neither of them heard it. Polk came back into the barn 5 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, and found them standing at a perfectly professional distance examining the calf, and he looked at them both and then at the cat that had followed him in from the cold, and the cat blinked, and Polk nodded very slightly, as though a long-standing prediction had been confirmed. The weeks that followed were a quiet negotiation of a new kind of balance. Neither of them was reckless. Jennie was deliberate about maintaining the clarity of her professional role. The hands answered to her as foreman, and that structure didn't change, and she was careful that no one could find evidence that her authority derived from anything other than competence. Tobias was equally careful about this, because he was smart enough to understand that undermining her position would undermine them both, and because he genuinely respected what she had built. What changed was the evenings, which were no longer just about the ledgers and the breeding records. They walked the perimeter of the south pasture in the blue winter evenings, talking about the ranch and about things beyond the ranch, about her father and his, about what she had loved about Colorado and what she had carried with her, about what he had wanted for the Abbott Ranch when he was young, and which parts of that vision he had achieved, and which parts he had set down along the way without quite noticing. She told him about her mother, who had died when Jennie was 9, and how her father had kept the grief so close that it had eventually become part of the furniture of the household, present but unacknowledged. She told him that she had learned to love the land partly because the land did not need anyone to manage its grief. It was simply itself, constant and indifferent in the way that was not cruelty but was its own kind of comfort. He told her about his father, who had built this ranch with nothing but the land grant and an absolute refusal to fail, and who had died 3 years ago without quite finishing a sentence. He had been saying to his son for a long time, something about the loneliness of a big operation and what it cost a man. Tobias had understood it only partially when his father said it, and more fully now. She took his hand in the snow one evening and held it, and he looked down at their joined hands and then at her, and he said, "I would like to stop being careful with you," she said. "I would like that too." "Carefully," he said. "That is not what not careful means," she said. "It means I do not want anything hasty. I want this to be real and right. I have worked hard for this position, and I want to be sure that she paused. The other part of things does not get ahead of the part that belongs to me separately." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "The foreman part." "Yes," he said, "that part is not going anywhere. It belongs to you regardless." "I am asking about a different part." She looked at him in the cold blue light. She said, "Then yes." They were married in April. It was a practical decision arrived at in the way that important practical decisions were made, which is to say that they discussed it plainly and agreed, and then told the hands and the town in approximately that order. The wedding was a Saturday event held in the yard of the Abbott Ranch because neither of them had strong feelings about churches, and both of them had strong feelings about the land. Augusto cooked for 4 hours. Polk wore a clean shirt, which Jennie had privately noted was a significant gesture. Hector Vasquez and his wife Catalina came, and Catalina brought flowers from her kitchen garden that she pressed into Jennie's hands with a warmth that surprised and moved Jennie considerably. The reverend from the Methodist church in town performed the ceremony in 15 minutes because both parties had specified brevity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias Abbott looked at Jennie Bailey Abbott with an expression that Polk later described to the gray barn cat as the face of a man who cannot believe his luck, which was not entirely accurate. Tobias Abbott could, if pressed, explain exactly why his luck was what it was, and it had to do with an advertisement on a tack board and a woman who had ridden 2 days in a saddle, and walked through his office door and told him she came for the foreman position, and he was grateful for every single step of the logic. Dell threw his hat in the air, which started a general throwing of hats, and for a moment the April sky above Harlan Creek was full of flying hats, which was perhaps not the most dignified wedding conclusion, but was, by any measure, a joyful one. The spring and summer of 1884 were the best operational year the Abbott Ranch had recorded. Jennie's breeding selection plan for the quarter horses produced 3 outstanding foals, including a filly from one of the anxious mares who had a stride that made Tobias stop and lean on the fence rail and say, quietly, "She is going to be something." The cattle operation ran clean and on schedule. The supply costs were down 11%. Hector Vasquez began sending some of his own horses to the Abbott breeding program and in the process became a genuine ally and gradually a friend. Dell earned a promotion to second hand, which Jennie gave him on a Tuesday morning at the yard meeting in front of the whole crew, and his face turned a color that matched his hair, and the crew applauded with varying degrees of enthusiasm and a good deal of ribbing, which Dell absorbed with a grin. Jennie discovered she was carrying a child in June, and she told Tobias on a Sunday morning before breakfast when they were sitting on the porch in the early light with their coffee, and he looked at her for a long moment and then he set down his cup with great care and said, "Are you well?" she said. "I am entirely well. I am also intending to keep working until I cannot." He said, "Of course," which was the right answer. She said, "You are not worried." He said, "I am terrified," very quietly, and then, "and also," and he seemed to run out of words, which was unusual for him, and he reached over and took her hand and held it, and she understood that the words he had run out of were something very large and bright. She worked through August. In September, she reduced her riding schedule but continued managing the breeding records and the supply operation from the office, and she trained Dell more intensively on the tactical operations so that he could cover the daily management with confidence. She was not wrong about any of this. She had planned her own partial absence with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and the ranch did not miss a beat. Their son was born in late October. He came on a clear, cold night when the stars were very thick above Wyoming, and the horses were quiet in their stalls, and Tobias sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours being absolutely useless, which was the most he had ever suffered at something he could not act on. And when the midwife finally opened the door and said the baby was here and the mother was fine, he crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bed and looked at Jennie, who was exhausted and clear-eyed, and holding a very small person who was expressing his opinions about the world at some volume. And Tobias said nothing at all for a long moment, and then he sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her, and they both looked at their son. "Samuel," Jennie said. She had told him the name weeks before, Samuel Abbott, after her father. "Samuel," Tobias repeated, in a tone he had never used before for any word. The baby looked at them with the blurry, unfocused ferocity of the newly arrived, and Tobias put one careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby, with the absolute authority of someone who had never heard a single discouraging word about himself, closed his tiny fist around it and held on. Jennie laughed softly, from somewhere deep and happy. Tobias looked at her, and she looked at him, and outside the window the Wyoming stars were uncountable. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was long but manageable, which was different from simply being survivable. Manageable meant they had enough hay, well-maintained equipment, a crew that knew what it was doing, and a foreman who had returned to full capacity by February with a young baby in a cradle in the corner of the office, and absolutely no reduction in the quality of her work, which the hands had accepted with a kind of admiring pragmatism. Dell had proved himself so completely in the fall that Jennie promoted him formally to lead hand in March, and he took the responsibility with a maturity that surprised even her, who had expected it. Polk retired in the spring of 1885. He did not call it retirement. He called it reducing his responsibilities, which meant he still lived on the ranch and worked when he felt like it and sat on the fence rail when he didn't, and nobody suggested he do anything else. On the day Jennie organized a quiet acknowledgement of his 30 years in cattle work, he shook her hand with the solemnity of a man who had been very precise in withholding this gesture, and he said, "You were right about the horse," she said, "Archimedes. He won 2 races in Rawlins last fall," Polk said. "Young Henderson from the Diamond Bar rode him. I watched him run." He shook his head slowly. "You named him right." She said, "You could have told me that before now," he said. "I was still deciding," and he meant it, and she understood completely. Archimedes had indeed become something exceptional. The nervous, isolated stallion of 3 years ago had developed into an athlete of rare quality, calm and focused in the way of intelligent animals who have been given the right work, responsive to the subtlest signals, with a speed in the quarter mile that made people stop and revise their understanding of what horses could do. Tobias had run him in 2 races the previous fall, and he had won both. And after the second race, 3 men had ridden out to the Abbott ranch to make offers, and Jennie and Tobias had sat down together and agreed that he was not for sale, because some things were worth more than their market price. By the summer of 1885, the Abbott Ranch had become something genuinely notable in Wyoming Territory, not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady, compounding effect of good management applied consistently over 2 years. Their cattle commanded a higher price at the Rawlins railhead than most operations in the region, because their animals were healthier and better conditioned, and the buyers had learned to trust the quality. Their quarter-horse breeding program had a reputation that drew buyers from as far as Denver. The crew was stable and skilled and proud of the operation in the way that people are proud of something they have helped build. Tobias gave full credit for this to Jennie, which she accepted in full because it was accurate. She acknowledged in return that the ranch had had good bones to build from. The land his father had chosen was excellent. The basic structure of the operation had been sound, and Tobias himself understood cattle and horses in a way that made her planning possible because he had given her the raw material to plan with. They had, in other words, built it together, which was the best kind of building. They had their arguments. They were both strong-willed and opinionated, and held their positions under pressure, which sometimes meant that an evening disagreement about grazing rotation or breeding selection or crew management went longer than either of them intended and ended with a temporary withdrawal to separate ends of the house that lasted exactly as long as it took one of them to think of a better argument that happened to coincide with the other's position. This process could take anywhere from 20 minutes to 1 evening, and it always resolved, because they had both long since established that the ranch and their marriage were more important than being right, and also because they were both more interested in finding the correct answer than in defending their initial position, which was a quality they had separately developed before meeting each other and which made them, in the long run, remarkably well suited. Samuel grew. He grew with the particular speed of children who are healthy and loved and interested in everything, and by the time he was walking, he had developed a powerful attraction to horses that neither of his parents found surprising. Tobias took him to the corral before he could properly walk without holding a fence rail, and he sat on the lowest rail and watched the horses with serious, focused eyes, and said something in baby language that appeared to be directed at the horses specifically. Jennie watched this from the porch one morning and felt, very clearly, that her life had arrived at something she had not known to want exactly as she had found it. She had wanted the work, the competence, the proof of what she could do. She had not thought clearly about the rest of it, had pushed it to the side as a complication, a distraction, something that could wait while the more important things happened. She understood now that it had been waiting patiently for exactly the right conditions, and it had arrived in the form of a ranch in Wyoming and a man who had lost a 20-minute argument and never brought it up again, and spent the rest of his life being grateful for losing it. In November of 1885, Hector Vasquez arrived at the ranch on a cold afternoon with a problem that he brought to Jennie first, which she noted and appreciated. He had a young horse, a 3-year-old from a good bloodline, who had gone sour in a way he couldn't account for. The horse refused work, was increasingly agitated, had lost weight. 3 people had looked at him and offered 3 different diagnoses. Vasquez had watched Jennie work with horses for 2 years, and he trusted her eye above the others. She rode over to his ranch that afternoon and looked at the horse, and within 30 minutes she had found the problem. A poorly fitted saddle that had been creating intermittent pressure sores on the horse's back, which had healed imperfectly and were now chronically sore. The saddle fit had been correct 2 years ago when the horse was younger and lighter and had changed as the horse matured. Nobody had checked. She told Vasquez this, and he looked at the horse for a long moment, and then he said, with the contained self-reproach of a man who cared deeply about his animals, "I should have seen it." She said, "You see it now. Get a new saddle fit to him properly and keep him off the back for 8 weeks and he will be himself again." He nodded. Then he said, "What do I owe you?" She said, "Nothing. We are neighbors." He said, "We are more than that," and held out his hand, and she shook it and meant it. Catalina Vasquez had become, in the 2 years since the flood crisis, something close to what Jennie thought of as a true friend, another woman in a landscape full of men and work, who understood both the specific satisfactions and the specific frustrations of being skilled in a world that had not always expected you to be. They visited when they could, which was not often enough, and when they did they talked with the speed and range of people making up for distance. And Tobias and Hector would sit across the fire or the table and conduct their own more measured conversation, and occasionally look at their respective wives with expressions of identical quiet contentment. It was Catalina who told Jennie, that November evening, that she was expecting her 3rd child in the spring, and Jennie said she was happy for her, and felt, beneath the happiness, the familiar stirring of her own body's insistence on being heard. She was expecting again before Christmas. She told Tobias on a December morning, standing in the kitchen while Augusto made noise in the adjacent room and Samuel sat in the doorway investigating a piece of harness leather that had somehow found its way into the house. Tobias looked at her with the same quality of careful attention he had the first time, and then he put his arms around her and held her, which was not what he had done the first time, and she leaned against him for a moment and let herself be held. "2," he said against her hair. "2," she agreed. "Is it? I am entirely well," she said, which he had learned to believe because she was accurate about herself with the same rigor she applied to everything else. She had been entirely well the first time, and she was entirely well now, and he trusted her assessment while also intending to be completely available for every possible contingency. Their daughter arrived in June of 1886. She came faster than Samuel had, in the afternoon, in the bedroom with the windows open to the summer air, and the sound of the ranch below, horses in the corral, the distant call of a hand to another hand, the particular quality of high plains summer afternoon that carried light like it was something the air was made of. Her name was Me Abbott, after no one in particular except herself, because when Jennie first looked at her she appeared to be entirely herself already, a particular person with particular opinions, and Tobias said, from the edge of the bed where he was holding his son with one arm and looking at his daughter with an expression that was beyond description, that she looked like a Me. Samuel looked at the baby with a grave 2-year-old's assessment, and reached out very carefully and touched the baby's cheek with one small finger, and the baby's eyes moved toward him, and Samuel looked up at his mother with an expression of complete seriousness and said, perfectly clearly, "Mine." Jennie laughed so suddenly and completely that the baby startled, and Tobias said, "Let the record show," and reached over and touched Jennie's face with the same gentleness. The summer and fall of 1886 ran like a well-maintained engine. The breeding program expanded. A contract was signed with a buyer in Denver for a regular supply of quarter horses that represented the most significant business development the ranch had seen in a decade, and Dell was formally promoted to second foreman, which Jennie had proposed and Tobias had agreed to without a moment's hesitation, and which Dell received with the same overwhelmed gratitude that had turned his face red at his first promotion. Only this time he also shook her hand with a firmness that said he understood what it meant. Jennie was not ready to step back from the foreman work. She was explicit about that. She had plans for the breeding program that were a 3-year vision, and she had no intention of handing them to anyone else. But having Dell at the tactical level gave her space for the strategic work that she was increasingly convinced was the ranch's most important growth direction. And it gave her time she hadn't had before, time for me and Samuel, time for the evening conversations with Tobias that had become as necessary to her as the coffee she drank every morning, and the particular angle of winter light she loved on the north pasture. In the fall of 1886, a woman rode into Harlan Creek looking for work. She was young Jennie, estimated 20, perhaps 21, with the look of someone who had been traveling for a while and was not entirely certain of her reception. She came to the Abbott Ranch because she had heard, somehow, through the particular telegraph of frontier information, that the Abbott Ranch had a woman foreman, which had struck her as the most hopeful thing she had heard in several months. Her name was Clara Hines, and she had been working cattle in Montana and had come south after the death of the operation she had worked for, looking for a place that would hire her for her skill and not dismiss her for her sex. She knocked on the ranch office door and said, "I heard there might be work here. I am good with cattle and better with horses, and I can do whatever needs doing." Jennie looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then she said, "Sit down. Tell me about the Montana operation." Tobias appeared in the doorway of the inner office, saw the scene, and very quietly withdrew and closed the door. And from behind the door came the faint sound of a smile that was probably not entirely audible, but that Jennie could have described the shape of precisely. Clara Hines was hired by the end of the afternoon. She was assigned to the breeding program under Jennie's direct supervision, and she was meticulous and careful, and had, as she had claimed, an excellent eye for horses. Within 3 months she had become an indispensable part of the operation, and had also, to Dell's visible consternation, turned his characteristic competent ease around horses into a strange new awkwardness whenever she was within 20 feet of him, which the rest of the crew noted with great private satisfaction. Jennie watched this development with fond recognition and said nothing, because some things worked better without commentary. By the end of 1886 and into the first months of 1887, the Abbott Ranch was everything Tobias Abbott's father had imagined it might become, and more than that, it was a living place, full of people who were good at their work and who felt the dignity of that goodness. The horses in the corral were healthy and fine. The cattle on the 12,000 acres were fat on good grass. The creek that ran through the north pasture ran clean and clear, and in February, when the first thin warmth came back to the land, the willows along it showed a green so new it looked impossible. Jennie stood at the corral fence on a morning in late February, the same position she had stood in on her very first dawn on the ranch, watching Archimedes in the early light, still strong, still electric, older now, but with no diminishment in that quality she had identified immediately as intelligence too big for its container. He had won 4 races and passed his qualities to 2 of his foals, and one of those foals was the filly Tobias had said would be something, and she had become, at 2 years old, the most promising young horse on the ranch. Tobias came out with 2 tin cups again, the same as that first morning. He handed her one and stood beside her at the fence, and they watched the horses in the early light. She said, "Do you remember the first morning?" He said, "I remember every morning." She said, "You were very resistant." He said, "I was very wrong." She said, You were wrong for approximately 20 minutes." he said, and then I was right for the rest of my life. She looked at him sideways, and he was looking at her with that expression she knew so well by now, the one that had nothing managed in it, that was just entirely him, turned toward her. She said, "The breeding plan for the spring is going to require 2 additional mares. I have found candidates. One of them is from the Vasquez stock, and Catalina has already agreed in principle." He said, "Of course she has," she said. "I need your signature on the acquisition order," he said. "Of course you do," she said. "Also, Samuel told me this morning that he intends to be a horse trainer when he grows up." He said, "He is 2.5, she said. "He is specific about it." He said, "He is my son," she said. "He is my son also." He said, "He gets the specificity from you and the horses from both of us." And she could hear the warmth in his voice, the deep particular warmth that was only for this, for her, for their children, for this land and this life that they had built together from a 20-minute argument and a Foreman position, and a woman who had ridden 2 days in a saddle and walked through a door and said what she came for. The sun came over the eastern ridge, and the snow on the north pasture turned gold, and Archimedes moved in the corral with that incomparable athlete's ease. And somewhere in the house Samuel was awake and asking for his mother in the frank, total way of small children, who do not yet know that need requires softening. And Mee was probably awake too, because she had not yet missed a morning that she could help. And Augusto would be building up the kitchen fire, and the hands would be stirring in the bunkhouse, and Dell was probably already out checking the south fence, because Dell was conscientious to the bone, and Clara Hins would be at the breeding barn with her notebook and her careful eye. All of it was real, all of it was present, all of it was, improbably and certainly, hers. Jennie Bailey Abbott drank her coffee in the February morning and felt, with the clear-eyed precision that had always been her best quality, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had come for the Foreman position. She had received that and everything that followed from it, and she had not wasted a single day of any of it. And on the fence beside her, Tobias Abbott, who had argued for 20 minutes and lost and never brought it up again, drank his coffee and watched his horses and felt, in the particular quiet of a good morning on good land with the person he loved most in the world standing 3 inches to his left, that the only argument he had ever truly won was the one he had lost. The creek in the north pasture ran on. The willows budded green against the snow. The filly moved at the edge of the corral with a stride that stopped the heart, and the gray Wyoming morning opened into a clear and limitless day.